The Duke of Roxholm had been married for the better part of a year, and in all that time he had not once looked at his wife across the long dinner table without a small cold tightening about his mouth that she had learned by now to read as plainly as print, the look of a man reminded, by the very sight of her, of a thing he would much rather forget. And Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, who missed nothing and said little, saw the look come and go that evening, as she had seen it come and go 100 evenings, and lowered her eyes to her plate, and went on with her dinner and did not let one flicker of what it cost her show upon her face. She had grown very good at that. A year of being loathed will teach a woman a great many things, and the first of them is how to keep her countenance while her heart is being quietly broken in a room full of silver and candlelight. For the Duke of Roxholm loathed his wife, and had loathed her from the day he married her, and had been at no great pains to hide it. He did not strike her, or rage at her, or do any of the loud, cruel things that the world would have noticed and condemned. His cruelty was of the cold and silent and perfectly genteel kind, the kind that leaves no mark and gives no grounds for complaint, the cold civility, the averted eye, the conversation confined to the necessary, the long silences at table, the rooms kept separate, the careful distance maintained at every hour of every day, so that the whole great house of Roxholm had come to feel, in the year of their marriage, like two cold countries sharing a border and no language. And over it all, whenever circumstance forced them into the same room, that small cold tightening about his mouth that told her, again and again, without a word needing to be said, that her husband could scarcely bear to be reminded that she existed. She knew why, of course. She had always known why, from before the wedding even. One did not need to be told. She was the price of his salvation, and he could not forgive her for it. The Dukedom of Roxholm had come to him 3 years before, on his father's death, in a state of ruin so complete that it had taken the family's men of business a full year merely to count the depth of the disaster. The old Duke, having spent a long life and a great fortune at the gaming tables and the racecourse and a dozen other roads to perdition, until the estates were mortgaged past their value, the rents pledged years ahead, the very paintings on the walls and the timber in the park sold or promised, and the proud ancient name of Roxholm standing for all its grandeur, one bad season from the bankruptcy courts. And there had been only one way to save it, the way that proud, ruined families have always saved themselves, and that was money, a great deal of money, more money than any respectable alliance among the impoverished great could provide. The kind of money that, in that age, lay in only one place, which was the city, in the coffers of the men of trade and banking who had made, in honest commerce, the fortunes that the great had gambled away. And so the Duke of Roxholm had done what his grandmother and his ruin between them required of him. He had sold his ancient name to the highest bidder, and married the daughter of a banker and saved his estate with her dowry, and had hated her, every day since, as the living, breathing proof of his humiliation. For a proud man can forgive almost anything sooner than the person who has seen him brought low, and Susannah Goodwin's whole existence was a daily reminder that the great Duke of Roxholm had been obliged to sell himself to the city to keep a roof over his ancestral head, that she had not wanted it either, that she had her own pride, and her own grief, and her own reasons, and had walked into that gilded cold marriage with as heavy a heart as his own, had never once occurred to him, for he had never troubled to ask, never troubled to look, never troubled to discover the smallest thing about the woman he had married, having decided on the day of the wedding exactly what she was, and having seen ever since only what he had decided. And so they lived, the Duke and Duchess of Roxholm, in their cold shared house, a year into a marriage that was a daily quiet misery to them both. And that evening, when dinner was done, the Duchess rose and bid her husband a composed good night that he answered with the briefest cold inclination of his head, and went up to her own rooms alone, as she did every night. And there, when her maid had gone and the house was still, she sat down at her writing desk, and took out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped her pen, and began, as she did most nights, to write a letter to the husband who loathed her, a letter she had not the smallest intention of ever letting him read. To understand the letters that Susannah wrote and never sent, the letters that would, in the end, undo a year of loathing in a single night, you must first understand the woman who wrote them and how she came to be a duchess loathed by her own husband, for she was not at all the creature the Duke of Roxholm had decided she was, and the distance between what she was and what he believed her to be is the whole of this story. She was 23, and she was the only daughter of Mr. Josiah Goodwin, one of the richest bankers in the city of London, a self-made man of great ability and greater integrity, who had risen from a clerk's stool to the command of a banking house that lent to half the great families of England, and who had given his only child every advantage that money could buy, and a great many that it could not. For Mr. Goodwin, whatever the great might think of his trade, was no vulgar upstart. He was a man of sense and reading and quiet dignity, who had married a gentlewoman and raised his daughter to be one. And Susannah had been educated as carefully as any earl's daughter in the land, in French and Italian and music and history and literature and all the accomplishments of her sex, but also, for her father believed in it, in sense and judgment and the management of money and men, so that she had grown up not merely accomplished but capable, with a clear, shrewd mind beneath her gentle manners and a backbone of quiet steel beneath her soft voice. She was, in short, exactly the sort of woman that a wise man would have counted himself fortunate to marry, handsome, clever, kind, dignified, and possessed of a fortune into the bargain. And she had been handed to a duke who could see in her nothing but the fortune and despised her for that. She had not wanted the match. That was the thing the duke had never grasped and never asked. Her father had wanted it, for Josiah Goodwin, for all his sense, had the one weakness of the self-made man, which was a hunger to see his blood ennobled, his grandchildren born to a rank he could never himself attain. And when the chance came to make his daughter a duchess, to plant his honest city fortune at the very summit of the English aristocracy, he had pursued it with all the formidable determination that had built his bank. And Susannah, a dutiful and loving daughter, had not had it in her to refuse the one thing her father had ever truly wanted of her. But she had gone into it with open eyes and a heavy heart. She had known she was being bought a husband, and had been as mortified by the transaction as the Duke himself, had known that she would be despised by the great world as a vulgar upstart who had purchased her coronet, had known, above all, for she was clever and had observed the cold, proud man she was to marry, that she was binding herself for life to a husband who would in all likelihood resent her, and that she was trading the comfortable obscurity in which she might have married for love among her own kind, for a gilded loneliness at the top of a world that would never accept her. She had known all of it, and she had done it anyway, for her father's sake, and walked to the altar with her chin up and her grief locked away where no one could see it, and resolved to make the best of the bargain she had not chosen, to be a good duchess and a good wife, and to earn, if she could, by patience and dignity and time, the regard of the man she had married. It was a brave resolve and a generous one, and it had been ground to powder over the long cold year that followed, against the granite of the Duke of Roxholm's unforgiving pride. It is worth pausing on the wedding itself, for it set the whole cold pattern of the year that followed, and showed, to anyone who had eyes to see, and there was no one there who did, exactly what each of these two proud people was bringing to the bargain, and exactly how badly they were misreading one another from the very first hour. It had been a grand wedding, as such alliances require. St. George's, Hanover Square, the whole of the great world in attendance, the banker's daughter married to the Duke before all the rank and fashion of England. And it had been, beneath its splendor, one of the most miserable occasions either of the principals had ever endured. The Duke had stood at the altar cold and rigid and white about the mouth, going through the forms of the sacrament as a man goes through a sentence, his pride a visible wall about him, unable to look at the woman beside him without that small cold tightening that she would come to know so well. And Susannah beside him had read his coldness perfectly, and had understood that her bridegroom regarded their wedding as a public humiliation to be borne, and had felt her own heart turn to lead within her, but had kept her countenance, and made her responses clearly, and given no one in that staring church the satisfaction of seeing what it cost her. Each had stood at that altar misreading the other entirely. The Duke had seen beside him a triumphant upstart, a banker's daughter crowing inwardly at her purchased coronet, and had loathed her for the triumph he imagined. And Susannah had been, in truth, a frightened, grieving young woman doing her duty with a breaking heart, who would have given the whole of her father's fortune to be married, instead, to some kind, ordinary man who wanted her. And the Duke, seeing the imagined triumph and not the real grief, had set the tone of the marriage in that hour, had resolved at the altar to keep this triumphant creature at the coldest possible distance, to deny her the satisfaction of his regard, to make her understand that though she had bought his name, she should never have his heart. And Susannah, meeting the coldness, had understood that her bridegroom hated her, and had locked her own hopes and fears away behind her dignity, where they would stay locked for a year. So they had begun their marriage as they would carry it on. Two proud people, each wounded, each misreading the other's pride for triumph and the other's grief for indifference, each retreating into a cold reserve that the other read as confirmation of the worst. And the tragedy of it, as Susannah would later write in one of her letters, was that they were so very alike, and might have been such friends. "We are two of a kind, my husband and I," she wrote, that first winter, though he would die sooner than believe it, both proud, both sold against our wills, both grieving in silence, both too well bred to let the grief show, both reading the other's mask for the real face. If we could but once see each other plain, I think we should recognize ourselves and laugh and be comforted. But we never shall, for the very pride that makes us alike is the pride that keeps us masked. And so we shall go on, two strangers who are secretly the same, growing old at opposite ends of a cold house, each believing themselves alone. It was an acute diagnosis, and a sad one, and it would have held true to the end, had it not been for a desperate old woman and a bundle of letters. For the one thing that could break the deadlock of two prides was the truth, plainly seen, and the truth was locked, all that year, in a writing desk, waiting. The character of Josiah Goodwin, Susannah's father, deserves a fuller hearing than the great world ever gave it, for the world saw only a vulgar banker buying his daughter a coronet, and the truth was both kinder and sadder than that. He had been born poor, the son of a Spitalfields weaver, and had risen by nothing but ability and integrity and 40 years of unremitting labor, from a banking-house clerk to the master of one of the great financial concerns of the kingdom. And he had done it cleanly, which in that age was no small thing, lending honestly and calling in his debts mercifully, and earning, among the men of the city who knew him, a reputation for probity that the gambling lords who borrowed from him could not have matched among themselves. He had married, late, a gentlewoman of small fortune and great refinement, who had loved him for his worth, and taught him the manners his origins had denied him. And when she died young, leaving him their one daughter, he had poured into Susannah all the love of his lonely heart and all the ambition of his self-made soul. And there was the flaw, the single flaw in an honest man, for Josiah Goodwin, who asked nothing for himself and would have scorned a title offered to him personally, harbored one consuming dream, that his daughter, his clever, beloved daughter, should rise where he could never rise, should enter the charmed circle that had always, for all his wealth, kept its door politely shut against the man of trade, should be, in a word, a lady, a great lady, a peeress, her children born to the rank that no amount of city gold could buy for himself. It was the dream of the self-made man, and it was, at bottom, a kind of love, however mistaken. And when the ruin of the Roxholm dukedom offered the chance to make his daughter a duchess, Josiah Goodwin had pursued it with all the force of 40 years' frustrated longing, and had not paused to ask, for he could not conceive, whether the coronet he so prized might be, to the daughter who must wear it, less a crown than a cage. For Susannah had tried to tell him. She had not refused. She loved him too well and owed him too much, and could not bear to break the heart of the father who had given her everything. But she had tried gently to make him see that a great marriage without love was no gift, that she would rather marry happily among her own kind than miserably among the great, that the cold, proud Duke would in all likelihood despise her, and her father, who could not imagine that any man could fail to treasure his Susannah, had brushed the fears aside with a loving confidence. The Duke would come to adore her. How could he not? She was the finest girl in England, and a little coldness at first was nothing. Rank was rank, and worth winning, and she would thank her father for it in the end. He had meant it all in love. He had been entirely wrong. And Susannah, seeing that she could not dissuade him without wounding him past bearing, had made the sacrifice that loving daughters have always made, had swallowed her own fears and married to fulfill her father's dream, and resolved to bear the cost herself and let him keep his happiness, so that even her misery in the cold marriage had been born, in part, to spare an old man the knowledge that his great gift had been a grief. She never told him. Through the whole cold year, when her father wrote his happy, proud letters and visited beaming and asked how she did, she answered him cheerfully and let him believe all was well, for she would not, having made the sacrifice, undo its whole purpose by letting him see it had been one. It was perhaps the truest measure of her that she bore not only her husband's coldness, but the long pretense required to keep her father happy in his ignorance. And it was one more thing the Duke of Roxholm learned, reading her letters, that shamed him to the soul, that the woman he had loathed as a grasping climber had in fact been a loving daughter sacrificing her own happiness for an old man's dream, and bearing it all, and him, in a silence designed to spare everyone but herself. The Duke of Roxholm was not, whatever his conduct toward his wife might suggest, a bad man at bottom. He was a proud man badly wounded, which is a different thing, though it can do nearly as much harm. To understand his loathing, and to forgive it in the end as far as it can be forgiven, you must understand the wound. And the wound was his father. The old Duke, Alexander's father, had been one of those magnificent ruinous men that the great families produce now and again to their cost. Charming, reckless, prodigal, utterly without self-command, a man who had inherited one of the greatest fortunes in England and spent 40 years destroying it, with a kind of careless genius, as though ruin were a thing to be pursued for its own sake. He had gamed. He had wagered. He had built and torn down and built again. He had kept a stable that beggared princes, and a cellar that beggared the stable, and a string of follies that beggared both. And he had done it all with a magnificent indifference to consequence that his contemporaries had found dashing, and his son had found, growing up in the shadow of it, slowly and increasingly terrifying. For Alexander had watched, through his whole boyhood and youth, the steady approach of the disaster his father would not see, had watched the great house grow shabby, the servants go unpaid, the duns appear at the door, the family treasures vanish one by one, had pleaded with his father as he grew old enough and been laughed off, had come at last to dread the day, plainly coming, when the whole proud edifice would collapse and the name of Roxholm be dragged through the bankruptcy courts for all the world to mock. He had grown up, in short, in the cold grip of a single overmastering fear and a single overmastering shame, the fear of ruin and the shame of a great name brought low, and he had sworn to himself 100 times that he would save it whatever it cost when his turn came. And then his turn had come with his father's death. And he had found that there was nothing left to save it with but the one thing his whole proud soul revolted at. He had gone over the accounts with the men of business and understood in one terrible week that the dukedom could not be saved by economy, nor by the sale of what remained, nor by any honorable shift a proud man might make, that it could be saved by one thing only, which was a great injection of new money, and that new money, in the England of his day, meant the city, meant trade, meant marrying. He, the Duke of Roxholm, the heir of 40 earls, the daughter of a banker, for her dowry, like a tradesman selling his name across a counter, It had been, to a man of his pride, the bitterest pill imaginable, that his father's magnificent ruin should be redeemed not by any nobility of his own, but by the vulgar expedient of selling himself to the city, that the proud name he had sworn to save could be saved only by an act that felt, to him, like its final degradation. And his grandmother, the formidable old dowager, who loved the name as fiercely as he, and was a great deal more practical about how to save it, had found him the bride, and pressed the match, and overborne his every objection with the unanswerable argument that there was no other way, and he had submitted because there was no other way, and had married Susannah Goodwin to save his estate, and had never from that day been able to look at her without seeing, not a woman, but the whole humiliation of his fall made flesh and seated at his table, the daily living proof that the great Duke of Roxholm had been reduced to selling himself for a banker's gold. He did not loathe her in truth, though he thought he did. He loathed his own humiliation, and his dead father's ruin, and his own helplessness, and she was simply the thing nearest to hand to loathe, the face he could put upon a shame too large and too old to face directly. It was monstrously unjust to her. He half knew it was unjust. In the buried, honest part of him, he kept carefully shut. But a wound to a proud man's pride is the slowest of all wounds to heal, and his had been festering for a year, and he had let it make him cruel, and it would take something very powerful indeed to lance it. It would be unjust to the Duke of Roxholm to leave the impression that his cold year was spent only in loathing his wife, for in truth he spent the most of it laboring, alone and unthanked, against the ruin his father had left him. And the labor was real and crushing, and it is part of why he had so little of himself left over for anything but resentment. For the saving of the estate had not ended with the wedding. The dowry had only bought time, stopped the immediate bleeding, held off the worst. The long, slow work of actually mending a dukedom 40 years in the wrecking remained, and it had fallen entirely on Alexander, and it was the labor of Hercules. He had spent that year as few of the great world ever spent a year, poring over accounts till past midnight, wrestling with mortgages and entails and the 1,000 tangled obligations of a vast encumbered estate, riding the lands to see for himself what could be retrenched and what restored, dismissing the dishonest stewards his careless father had let flourish, and finding honest ones, denying himself the expenses his rank was thought to require, living behind the grand facade with a frugality that would have astonished the world, that imagined him merely proud. He had carried it all alone, for he trusted no one with the full shameful knowledge of how bad things truly were, and would have died sooner than let the great world see the Duke of Roxholm reduced to counting shillings. And the loneliness of it, the grinding unshared weight of it, had worn him down through the year into a man with no warmth to spare, and a perpetual cold ache of shame and fear beneath his pride. And beneath the labor lay the grief he could not speak. For the ruin was his father's doing, and he had loved his father. That was the thing no one understood, the thing that twisted everything, had loved the magnificent ruinous man even while watching him destroy them, had grieved his death even while cursing the wreckage it revealed. And he had no way to lay the grief and the anger down, for one cannot rage at the dead, nor mourn cleanly a man whose folly has beggared one's house. So the grief had festered alongside the shame, the two of them souring together through the cold year, and Alexander had carried both in a rigid silence, letting no one near, least of all the wife, whose very presence reminded him daily of the whole catastrophe, and his coldness to her had been in part simply that he had nothing left, that a man laboring alone under such a double burden of toil and grief and shame has no surplus of tenderness for anyone, and that what little warmth survived in him he had walled off entirely for fear that to feel anything was to feel all of it, the whole unbearable weight, at once. It did not excuse his cruelty to Susannah, nothing wholly excused that, but it explained it, and Susannah, watching him with her clear, kind eye, had understood it better than he understood it himself, and had written of it. My husband is a man carrying a mountain alone, and too proud to set it down or ask for help. And he has no strength left over to be kind, and mistakes his exhaustion for hatred of me because I am there, and because hating me is easier than feeling the grief and the shame the mountain is made of. If he would only let me help him carry it. And I could. I know more of mountains of debt than he does, being a banker's daughter. I think the weight might lift, and the kindness come back. For I do not believe the kindness is gone, only buried under the load. But he will not let me near the load. To share it would be to confess how heavy it is, and his pride cannot bear that I should know. So he carries it alone and grows colder, and I watch and could help, and am not let. And the Duke, reading that, had understood that she had seen, a year before he could see it himself, the exact shape of his trouble and the exact cure for it, and that the wife he had shut out as a humiliation had been, all along, the one person both able and willing to help him carry the mountain, if only his pride had let her, and the waste of it, the sheer blind, wasteful folly of it, was almost more than he could bear to think of. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp low, the dark drawn close, the day's business set gently down, then settle in, and let me tell you about a woman who wrote a year of letters to a husband who loathed her and never sent a one, and about the night he read them at last. For this is a story about pride, and about the things we are too proud to say, and about how a whole year of cruelty can be undone in a single hour by the discovery of what was in another heart all along, if only we had troubled to look. I shall tell you before the end where in the world I picture you sitting. But first you must know what Susannah wrote, alone, by candlelight, in the long, cold evenings of that loveless year, and why she never let him see a word of it. She had begun the letters out of loneliness in the first weeks of the marriage, when the full cold scale of her situation had come home to her, and she had found that she had no one in all the world to tell it to. She could not tell her father, who was so happy and so proud, and who had meant only her good. She could not tell the great cold relations who had received her with such thinly veiled contempt. She could not tell the servants or the few acquaintances who would only have gossiped. She had no mother, no sister, no friend within reach of that gilded prison. And so, being a woman who had always thought best with a pen in her hand, she had done the only thing left to her. She had begun to write it all down, in the form of letters to the one person who ought, by every right, to have been her confidant and her comfort, and was instead the author of her grief. Her husband. She wrote to him because there was no one else to write to, and because the things she most needed to say were things that, in any true marriage, a wife would say to her husband, and since she could not say them to the cold stranger she had married, she said them to the page instead, addressed to him, and locked them away in her writing desk, and never sent them, and told herself she never would. They were not, at first, love letters. They were further from it than can be imagined. The early ones were full of a banked and bitter anger, for Susannah, whatever her dignity in public, was no saint in private, and the injustice of being despised for a transaction she had wanted no more than he did had stung her to the quick, and she had poured the sting onto the page. "You think me a vulgar upstart who bought your name," she had written in the second month. "You are wrong, but I shall not trouble to tell you so, since you have not troubled to ask. I wanted this marriage no more than you did. I too was sold, by a loving father who could not see that a coronet is no gift to a woman who must wear it in a house where she is hated. We are neither of us here by choice, your grace. We are two proud people sold to one another against our wills, and the difference between us is only that I have had the sense to make the best of it, and you have not. I could almost pity you, if you did not make it so very hard." That was the early Susannah, angry, clear-eyed, unbroken, giving as good as she got, on the safe blank field of the unsent page where he could not see her do it. And had the letters stayed so, they would have been only the harmless private revenge of an ill-used woman, and would have changed nothing. But they did not stay so. For the strangest thing happened to Susannah Goodwin over the long, cold year of writing to the husband who loathed her. watching him day after day with the clear, shrewd, observing eye her father had given her, watching him struggle with the ruined estate, and grieve the father he could not openly grieve, and wear his pride like armor over a wound. She came slowly and against every intention to understand him, and understanding him she came more slowly and far more against her will to love him. And the letters changed with her from anger to understanding to a hopeless tenderness she would have died sooner than let him see. The cold year was not without its small, unwitnessed scenes, moments when the two prides came near to touching and drew back, and the marriage might have turned and did not. And Susannah recorded them in her letters, where alone they were ever seen, and they are worth the telling, for they show how narrow the margin was, all that year, between the loathing and the love. There had been the night of the Duke's fever. He had taken a chill early in the marriage that turned to a feverish cold and kept him 3 days to his bed, and Susannah, hearing of it, and being his wife whatever the coldness between them, had gone to his room, had nursed him those 3 nights with her own hands, sitting up with him, cooling his brow, seeing that he was tended, doing quietly all the offices of a wife. And the Duke, in his fever, half delirious, had not known whose hands they were, and had been gentled by them, and had murmured his thanks to the cool presence at his bedside, without knowing he thanked the wife he loathed. And on the 3rd night, the fever breaking, he had woken clear-headed in the small hours and seen her there, seen his wife, asleep in the chair by his bed, worn with 3 nights' watching, having nursed him without his asking and without his thanks. And something had moved in him, in that clear small hour, looking at her tired, sleeping face, that was not loathing at all. A question, a doubt, a first faint crack. And then she had woken and seen him watching, and risen at once with cool dignity to ask how he did, retreating instantly behind her reserve, and he, caught between the softening of the night and the cold habit of the day, had answered her stiffly, coldly, with a curt word of thanks that was almost a dismissal, and the crack had closed, and the moment passed, and she had gone away. And that night she had written, "I nursed my husband through his fever, and for one moment, waking, he looked at me as though he saw me, really saw me, and did not hate what he saw. And then the day came back into his eyes, and he thanked me as one thanks a servant and sent me away. I was so close tonight to reaching him. I felt it. And then the wall came down again. I do not think I shall try again. It costs too much to come so near and be sent away. Better not to hope. But oh, for one moment he saw me." There had been, too, the matter of the tenants. A hard winter had come, and want with it on the Roxholm lands. And Susannah, who had her father's sense of obligation, and none of the great world's indifference to the poor, had quietly set about relieving the worst of it, had visited the cottages and sent food and fuel and physic, and done, out of her own private allowance and her own initiative, a great deal of good among the Duke's people without a word to the Duke. And the Duke had discovered it by accident, weeks later, hearing his tenants bless the Duchess's name, and had been, for a moment, ashamed and moved and curious, for it was not the conduct of the grasping upstart he had decided she was. He had said nothing to her of it, pride forbade, but he had not quite forgotten it either, and it had gone into the slow account that his letters would one day total up. And Susannah, who never knew he knew, had written only, "I have been among the tenants this week. They are in want, and no one had thought to help them, the Duke being too occupied with the great debts to see the small sufferings. I do what I can. It eases my heart to be of use to someone, since I am of no use, and less than none, to my husband. And these poor people at least are glad of me, which is a novelty I confess I find I treasure. I should have made a tolerable duchess, I think, if only I had been let. Well, the tenants shall have a duchess, even if the Duke will not." And the Duke, reading that a year later, had had to set the letter down and walk to the window and stand a while, for he had not known, until he read it, how much good she had done in silence, nor how starved she had been, in his cold house, for the simple chance to be of use and be valued. And he had thought, looking out over the lands her quiet care had eased, that he had been given a great lady for a wife, and had spent a year too blind with pride to let her be one. It was Lady Camilla Devereux who brought matters at last to their crisis. Though she meant only mischief and could not have known she was hastening the very reconciliation she most wished to prevent. Lady Camilla was the daughter of the Marquis of Wexford, a celebrated beauty of 26, well born to the bone, and she had, for several years before the Duke of Roxholm's marriage, considered him as good as her own. The two families had been intimate, the match had been spoken of, and Lady Camilla, who had never doubted that she would one day be a duchess, and had selected the Duke of Roxholm as the proper vehicle, had been first incredulous and then coldly furious when he had married, instead of her, the daughter of a city banker, had taken it as a personal affront, an outrage against the natural order, a thing scarcely to be borne. That the Duke had married for money to save his estate, she perfectly understood, and could almost have forgiven. What she could not forgive was the existence of the upstart Duchess herself, the vulgar Goodwin creature seated in the place that should have been Camilla's, and she had set herself from the day of the marriage to make the new Duchess feel, by every delicate cruelty in her considerable arsenal, exactly how far beneath her exalted station she had climbed. She was, in short, the perfect embodiment of all the cold, proud snobbery that had poisoned the marriage from the start, the living voice of the world's contempt for the bought bride. And she had found, in the Duke's evident loathing of his wife, the most delicious encouragement. For if the Duke himself despised the creature, then Camilla's own campaign of cruelty was merely good taste, and she pursued it with a clear conscience and a happy heart. She had grown bolder as the cold year wore on, and the Duke's coldness showed no sign of thawing, had begun to let it be understood in the drawing-rooms of the great that the Roxholm marriage was a disaster, that the Duke bitterly regretted it, that the upstart Duchess was no more accepted by her husband than by society, and that it could only be a matter of time before some arrangement was come to and the field cleared. And she had begun, with the patience of a huntress, to put herself once more in the Duke's way, to be all sympathy and understanding, the well-born friend who comprehended his humiliation as no banker's daughter ever could, the gracious lady waiting in the wings for the inevitable. And the crisis came at a great dinner, given by a county neighbor, at which both the Roxholms and Lady Camilla were guests, for there, in the drawing-room after dinner, Lady Camilla, emboldened by wine and by the Duke's cold civility toward his wife, allowed herself a cruelty more open than her usual delicate kind, said in a caring voice to a little circle that included the Duchess, something about how trade would tell, how one could not make a silk purse of a sow's ear whatever the dowry, how poor dear Roxholm had paid a higher price for his salvation than mere money, and must repent his bargain daily. And she said it with a sidelong, smiling glance at the Duchess that made the cruelty unmistakable and public. And the little circle tittered, and Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, sat very still, with her chin level and her color high, and waited, as she had waited 100 times, for her husband to defend her. And he did not. That was the thing that broke her. At the last, not Lady Camilla's cruelty, which she had long since learned to bear, but her husband's silence under it. For the Duke of Roxholm heard Lady Camilla's insult to his wife in a public room before a tittering circle, and he said nothing, did not rebuke it, did not deflect it, did not by the smallest word or look defend the woman who bore his name, but only sat cold and remote and let it stand, as though it were no concern of his what was said of the Duchess of Roxholm, as though he half agreed. And Susannah, watching her husband sit silent while another woman mocked her to her face, understood with a cold, clear finality that there was no hope, that a man who would not defend his wife from a public insult would never love her, never respect her, never be anything to her but the cold author of her loneliness, and that she had spent a year of patience and dignity and secret hopeless love on a man who would sit by and let her be shamed and never stir. And something in her, that had endured a great deal, quietly broke, and she resolved, sitting there with her chin up and her heart in pieces, that she was done. Lady Camilla Devereux deserves a closer look, for she was the voice of the world that had poisoned the marriage, and to understand her is to understand the whole atmosphere of cold contempt that Susannah had to breathe for a year. She was beautiful, and she was well born to the very marrow, the daughter of a marquess, descended from a line that had been great when the conqueror was a novelty, and she had been raised in the serene certainty that birth was the one thing that mattered in the world and that she possessed it in the highest degree. She was not stupid. She was, in her cold way, quite clever, but her cleverness had been wholly given over to the maintenance of her own superiority, and she had never in her life been required to be anything but ornamental and well-descended, and so she had become, by 26, a creature of pure pedigree, all surface and status, with a heart shrunk to the size of a calling card. She had marked the Duke of Roxholm for her own as a girl marks the finest house in the street, not from love, for she was not capable of much of that, but from a sense of fitness. He was the greatest match of his generation, and she the greatest beauty of hers, and the symmetry pleased her, and she had waited in serene entitlement for the inevitable, and had been outraged past forgiveness when the inevitable failed to occur, and the Duke married trade instead. What galled her was not losing the Duke. She did not want him as a woman wants a man. What galled her was the affront to the order of things, that birth should be passed over for money, that a Devereux should be set aside for a Goodwin, that the great prize she had considered hers by right of blood should be carried off by a creature from the city. It was, to Lady Camilla, very nearly a crime against nature, and she had set herself to punish it, with the cold persistence of wounded vanity, by making the upstart Duchess feel her inferiority at every turn. She was a connoisseur of the genteel cruelty, the insult wrapped in a compliment, the exclusion managed so smoothly it could not be protested, the pointed kindness that wounded worse than rudeness. And she had practiced the whole art upon Susannah for a year, in the drawing-rooms of the great, with a skill that drew blood every time and never once gave the victim grounds to object. And she had been encouraged in it fatally by the Duke's own coldness, for so long as the husband visibly loathed the wife, Camilla's cruelty was merely the echo of his, sanctioned and safe, and she had grown bolder and bolder on the strength of it, until she mistook the marriage's coldness for its imminent collapse, and overreached, first at the county dinner, and then, ruinously, at her own mother's ball. It was her tragedy, insofar as so small a soul can have a tragedy, that she never understood what had changed. She had built her whole campaign on the assumption that the Duke shared her contempt for his wife, and when the Duke's contempt turned, overnight as it seemed to her, into devotion, she had no framework to comprehend it, and assumed only some temporary madness or some low scheme of the upstarts, and pressed her attack precisely when she should have retreated, and was routed because she was fighting a war that had already ended without her noticing. She represented, in the end, exactly the thing the Duke had to renounce to be saved, the cold worship of birth over worth, of price over value, of the surface over the soul. And when he stood up in her mother's ballroom and chose his banker's daughter before all the world, he was not merely defending his wife, but repudiating the whole creed of which Lady Camilla was the high priestess. And her routing was the routing of that creed, which is why the county relished it so, for there were many in that ballroom whom Lady Camilla's kind had wounded, and who were not at all sorry to see the cold cult of pure pedigree get for once its comeuppance at the hands of an honest banker's daughter with a quicker wit and a warmer heart. She went to him the next morning in his study and told him she meant to leave, and she did it with a composure that should have warned him, had he known her at all, that this was no fit of temper, but a settled and final thing. "I shall not trouble you much longer, Your Grace," she said. "I have come to tell you that I mean to remove to the dower house at Ashworth. It stands empty, and is far enough from here that we need not meet, and to live there quietly, apart from you, for the remainder of our marriage. You need not fear any scandal. I shall be very discreet. I shall say that my health requires the country, or whatever you please, and no one need know, that the Duke of Roxholm has simply ceased to be able to endure the sight of his wife. You will have your house to yourself again and your peace, and need never again be reminded by my presence at your table of the bargain you so bitterly regret. I had hoped, when I married you, to earn your regard in time by patience and by being, as well as I could, a good wife to you. I see now that it was a foolish hope, and I have given it up. I will not spend the rest of my life being despised in my own home, your grace. I have too much respect for myself, whatever you may think of my origins, to do that. So I will go where I am not loathed, and trouble you no further, and you may make of the rest of your life and your saved estate whatever you can. I wish you well. I mean that. It is the strange truth. I wish you very well indeed. Good morning." And she had inclined her head with perfect dignity, and turned and walked out of his study, leaving the Duke of Roxholm staring after her with an expression he could not himself have named. He told himself he was glad. He told himself through that whole strange, unsettled day that it was the best possible solution, that he would have his house and his peace, that the daily reminder of his humiliation would be removed, that he ought to be nothing but relieved. And he found, to his deep annoyance, that he was not relieved in the least, that the thought of the dower house at Ashworth, and his wife living there alone, quietly, apart, for the rest of her life, sat in his chest like a swallowed stone, that her words kept returning to him. "I had hoped to earn your regard. I wish you well. I mean that," in a voice that did not sound at all like the voice of the vulgar scheming upstart he had decided she was, but like the voice of a woman of dignity and even of generosity, a woman who had just told him with her chin up that she had once hoped to be a good wife to him, and had given up the hope. And he found that he did not, after all, quite know who it was that he had been loathing for a year, and that the not knowing troubled him more than he could account for. But he was a proud man and a stubborn one, and he had a year's habit of cold resentment to overcome, and so he did nothing that day but brood and tell himself he was glad. And he let his wife make her quiet preparations to depart, and he might have let her go and lived out his life in his cold, saved house, never knowing what he had thrown away, had it not been for his grandmother and the bundle of letters on the morning Susannah was to leave. The old Dowager Duchess of Roxholm, Alexander's grandmother, had arranged the marriage, and had watched its cold failure with a growing fury that she had kept, with great difficulty, to herself. And on the morning her granddaughter-in-law was to leave, she decided that she had kept silent quite long enough. The dowager was a shrewd, worldly, unsentimental old woman of 75, who loved 3 things in the world: her family's name, her grandson, and latterly, and to her own surprise, the banker's daughter she had got him to marry. For the dowager had arranged the match coldly enough, as a business of saving the estate, and had expected to think no more of the girl than of any other necessary transaction. And she had been taken quite off her guard by discovering, over the year, that the girl was a treasure, clever and kind and dignified, and possessed of more sense and more heart than the whole of the great cold family put together. And she had watched, with mounting incredulity and rage, while her fool of a grandson, too blinded by his wretched pride to see what was under his nose, repaid the woman who had saved them all with a year of cold contempt, and drove her, at last, to the point of departure. The dowager had remonstrated with him more than once in her dry, sharp way, and been rebuffed, and she had comforted the girl as well as her undemonstrative nature allowed, and grown fond of her, and been the one member of the family who treated the young duchess with kindness. And it was to the dowager, in the end, in a moment of rare confidence, that Susannah had once let slip the existence of the letters, had said, with a sad small smile, that she kept her own counsel by writing it all down in letters to the Duke that she would never send, since they were the only way she had of saying the things one could not say aloud to a husband who would not listen. So the dowager knew the letters existed, and on the morning of the departure, while Susannah was occupied with the last of her packing, the old dowager went quietly into her granddaughter-in-law's sitting-room and to the writing desk, and found there, for Susannah, in her grief and haste, had not destroyed them, and had perhaps in some unacknowledged corner of her heart not quite been able to, the bundle of letters, a year's worth, tied with a ribbon, everyone addressed to the Duke of Roxholm and never sent. And the dowager took them and carried them without a word to anyone straight to her grandson's study, and laid the bundle down upon the desk before him, and said, in a voice that brooked no argument, "Your wife leaves this house in 2 hours, Alexander, and you mean to let her go, and you are the greatest fool that the name of Roxholm has produced in 300 years, which, considering your father, is no small distinction. I have one thing to say to you, and then I have done. These are letters your wife has written to you, every night. For the whole of the year you have spent loathing her, letters she never sent, because she knew you would not read them or would mock them if you did. I have not read them. They are not mine to read, but I know what is in them in the general way because I know the girl, which is more than you have ever troubled to do. You have 2 hours. Read them or do not read them, that is your affair. But if you let that woman walk out of this house without reading what is in this bundle, then you will deserve every cold and empty year of the life you will have afterward, and I shall not waste another breath upon you. There, I have said it. The choice is yours. God knows why. You have never made a wise one in your life." And she had turned and stalked out and shut the door, and the Duke of Roxholm sat alone in his study with the bundle of his wife's unsent letters before him, and the clock ticking out his 2 hours. And after a long while, with a hand that was not quite steady, he untied the ribbon and began to read. He read them in order, for she had dated every one, and the order told its own story, the story of a year and of a heart that he had never once thought to wonder about. The early letters cut him like knives, for they were angry, and the anger was just. "You think me a vulgar upstart who bought your name," he read in the 2nd month's letter. "You are wrong, but I shall not trouble to tell you so, since you have not troubled to ask. I wanted this marriage no more than you did." He had not known that. It had genuinely never occurred to him, so wrapped had he been in his own humiliation, that she might have been humiliated too, that the transaction he found so degrading might have been just as degrading to her, that she too might have been sold by an ambitious father against the grain of her own pride. He read on, and the letters told him what he had never asked, that she had not wanted the coronet, that she had married to please a father she loved, that she had come to the marriage not in triumph but in dread, knowing she would be despised, and had resolved to bear it with dignity and to try, by patience, to earn his regard. "I will be a good wife to him," she had written in the 1st month, "whatever he thinks of me, because it is the only honorable thing left to me to do, and because a marriage, even a cold one, even a bought one, is a thing that 2 people of good will might yet make something of, if only one of them will begin. I will begin. I will be patient. I will not let his coldness make me cold." He set that letter down and sat for a moment with his hand over his eyes, for he remembered that 1st month and his own conduct in it, and how he had met her patient, careful overtures with a cold civility designed to crush them, and he understood for the first time what he had been crushing. The middle letters were worse because they were not angry any more. They had turned to a clear-eyed understanding that was harder to bear than any reproach. For she had watched him with an attention he had never dreamed he was under, and she had seen and set down the truth of him that he thought no one knew. "I begin to understand my husband," she had written in the spring. "He is not cruel by nature. I have watched him with his tenants and his servants when he does not know himself observed, and he is just and even kind. His cruelty is all for me, and I think I see why. I am the price of his rescue, and he cannot forgive me for it, because to forgive me would be to face the thing itself, his father's ruin, his own helplessness, the selling of his name. I am the face he has put upon a shame too large to look at directly. It is monstrously unfair to me, but I find, understanding it, that I cannot quite hate him for it, for I see that he suffers more than I do. I have only lost a hope, but he has lost his pride, which to a man like him is very nearly his soul, and a man drowning in shame will clutch at any cruelty that keeps him from going under. I wish I could tell him that I understand. I wish I could tell him that the marriage need not be the badge of his disgrace, that it might be, if he would let it, the beginning of his recovery. But he will not let me near enough to tell him anything, so I tell the page instead. He read that, and read it again, and found that his eyes were not dry, for she had seen him wholly accurately to the very bottom, and had not despised what she saw, but pitied it and forgiven it, and longed to heal it, and he had repaid her sight of him with a year of contempt. And then came the letters he could barely read at all, for in them, against all reason, against everything he had done to her, the understanding had turned to love. I am in great danger, she had written in the summer, of the most foolish thing a woman in my position could possibly do, which is to fall in love with my own husband. I know it is absurd. I know he loathes me. I know there is no hope in it, and that I am laying up only grief for myself. But I cannot seem to help it. For I have watched him a year now, and I have seen beneath the cold, proud shell a man of honor and depth and buried tenderness, a man worth 10 of the fashionable fools who never had a real trouble in their lives. And I have come to love that man, the real one, the one he hides, with a completeness that frightens me, and that I must hide as he hides himself. For if he knew it, he would only despise me the more, or worse, pity me. So I love him in secret, and write it here where he will never see, and go down each morning to be loathed by the man I love, and come up each night to tell the page how dearly I love him. And I think, some nights, that this is the strangest and loneliest fate that ever befell a woman, to be bound for life to the one man in the world she wants, and to be hated by him, and to want him still. And the Duke of Roxholm, reading that in his cold study, with the clock ticking out the last of his 2 hours, put his head down upon his wife's letters and wept as he had not wept since he was a boy, for the year he had wasted, and the cruelty he had done, and the love he had been offered and trampled without ever knowing it was there. And then he raised his head and wiped his face, and read the last letter, which was dated the night before, and which broke and remade him in a single page. My dear. The last letter began, and the my dear undid him before he had read a word more, for in a year she had never once to his face called him anything but your grace. My dear, for I shall call you so once here on this last page, since I shall never call you so aloud. I am leaving you tomorrow, and so this is the last of these letters I shall write, and I find I want it to be a kind one, and not an angry one, for I am done with anger. It costs too much, and I have only a little strength left, and I had rather spend it on something better. So let me say, here where you will never read it, the things I should have liked to say, in some other and happier marriage than ours, that I do not blame you, that I understand why you could not love me and bear you no grudge for it, that you were dealt a cruel hand, a ruined estate, a wasted inheritance, a forced marriage to a stranger you could not want, and that I think you have borne the most of it better than you know, and that the cruelty you showed me was only ever the overflow of a pain too great for you to carry, and that I forgive it freely and entirely, and wish you nothing but good. And let me say, since it can do no harm now, that I have loved you, that for the better part of this hard year I have loved you with my whole heart, hopelessly and in secret, the real you, the good man under the cold one, and that loving you, even unreturned, even in grief, has been the truest thing in my life, and I do not regret it, and I would not undo it, though it has cost me dear. I am going away, so that you may be free and at peace, and troubled no more by the sight of the bargain you regret. But I wanted you to know, though you never shall, that the bargain was not all on your side, that you got whatever you may think a wife who loved you, and that if things had been otherwise, if you had only once turned and looked at me and let me near, I think we might have been happy, you and I, happier than either of us has ever been. It was not to be. I do not blame you. I love you. Goodbye. Your wife, who signs herself this once by the name you never use, Susannah. The Duke of Roxholm sat very still for a long moment after he had finished, and then he rose so fast he overturned his chair and went out of his study at a run, actually ran, the cold, composed Duke of Roxholm, ran down his own grand staircase like a boy, the letter still crushed in his hand, for the clock had struck, and his 2 hours were spent, and somewhere in that house the woman who had written, I love you, goodbye, was even now stepping into a carriage to be taken away forever. He found her in the great hall, cloaked and bonneted, drawing on her gloves, the carriage waiting at the open door beyond, his grandmother standing grimly by, and he stopped at the foot of the stairs, breathless and wild and entirely unlike himself, and said the only thing in his heart, which was her name, Susannah. And then, because she had turned and was staring at him, Susannah, do not go. For God's sake, do not go. I have read your letters. I have read all of them. I have read, and here his voice broke entirely. I have read what you wrote last night, and I cannot let you go. I cannot. I have been a fool and a brute and the blindest man in England, and I have only just this hour discovered that I have spent a year throwing away the one good thing my wretched life was ever given. And I am asking you, I am begging you, do not get into that carriage. Stay, only stay, and let me try, however little I deserve the chance, to become the man you somehow saw in me, and somehow, God knows why, loved. And the great hall rang with the silence after it, and Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, stood with one glove half drawn on, and looked at her husband as though she had never seen him before. The 2 hours the dowager had given him did not suffice. The Duke read the letters through, and then sat the rest of that day and the half of the night in a reckoning with himself such as he had never before undertaken, and it changed him more deeply than the letters alone could have done, for the letters had shown him the truth of Susannah, but it was the long reckoning that followed that showed him at last the truth of himself, and it was not a truth he had ever before had the courage to face. He had built his whole life, he saw now, upon his pride, and his pride, he saw, was not the noble thing he had always taken it for, but a kind of cowardice in fine clothes. He had been proud at the altar, too proud to look at the frightened girl beside him and wonder what she felt. He had been proud all year, too proud to let his wife near the burden of the estate, too proud to confess how bad things were, too proud to grieve his father openly or to ask any living soul for help, too proud, above all, to examine whether the woman he loathed had earned the loathing or merely served as a convenient face, for a shame he dared not look at directly. His pride had cost him everything, a year of his life, a year of hers, the love she had offered him in silence, very nearly the wife herself, and it had given him nothing in return but the cold satisfaction of feeling superior to a woman who was, he now understood, in every way that mattered, his superior. He had thought himself a proud man wronged by circumstance. He saw now that he was a frightened man hiding behind his pride, who had punished an innocent woman for the crime of having witnessed his fall, and called the punishing a kind of dignity. And there was his father to reckon with, too, in the long night, for he understood, reading Susannah's clear-eyed letters about him, that he had been becoming his father, not in the ruinous spending, but in the deeper thing, the magnificent self-absorption, the refusal to see the cost of one's conduct to those around one. His father had ruined them all without once truly seeing the people his folly harmed, and Alexander, in his cold pride, had been wronging his wife without once truly seeing her, locked in his own grievance as his father had been locked in his own pleasures, each blind in his own way to the human beings in his power. The thought horrified him. He had spent his life resolved to be everything his father was not, and he had become, in the one way that perhaps mattered most, exactly the same. A man so wrapped in himself that the suffering of those nearest him was invisible to him. And Susannah's letters had been the mirror, held up at last, in which he saw it, and what he saw shamed him to the depths, and, shaming him, freed him. for a man who has truly seen the worst in himself and faced it and refused it is no longer its prisoner. He rose before dawn, that long night ended, a changed man, not merely moved, as Susannah would later fear, by a passing sentiment, but altered at the root, his pride broken open and the better man beneath it, the man she had somehow seen and loved, set free at last to act. And it was this, more than the letters, more than the running to the hall, more than all the fine words of his public confession, that made his change endure when she had feared it would fade. For he had not merely felt something in the night, he had understood something, and understanding does not fade as feeling does. He had met himself in the dark and not flinched and come out the other side. And the man who came down the stairs at dawn to beg his wife to stay was a man who would never again be the cold, proud creature of that wasted year, because he had seen, finally and completely, what that creature was and wanted no more of him. The letters had shown him Susannah. The reckoning had shown him himself. He needed both to be saved, and he had got both, in one long night, at the 11th hour, by the grace of a desperate old woman and a bundle of ribbon-tied pages, and he never afterward passed his grandmother's chair without a small private gratitude that he could never quite put into words, and that she, being who she was, would have waved away unheard. She did not melt. That was the measure of her, that even then, with her husband breaking before her, and every word she had longed for a year to hear pouring out of him at last, Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, did not simply fall into his arms, for she had her dignity, and she had been wounded past easy healing, and she was far too clear-eyed a woman to mistake a single hour's emotion for the work of a lifetime's change. "You have read my letters," she said slowly, and her voice was steady, though her face was not. "And they have moved you. I do not doubt it. They were the truth, and the truth is moving, and you are not, whatever this year has made you, a man without a heart. But I have learned something this year, Your Grace, that I will not now unlearn in a single morning, however much I might wish to. I have learned what it is to live with a man who does not love me, and I will not go back to it. And I cannot tell, you cannot tell this morning, with my words still wet on the page and your own heart in an uproar, whether what you feel now is love, or only the pity and the guilt and the sentiment that any decent man would feel, reading what you have read. Sentiment fades, Your Grace. Guilt fades. Pity fades fastest of all. And if I unpack my trunks this morning on the strength of an hour's feeling, and the feeling fades, as feeling does, then in a month I shall be exactly where I was, loathed in my own home, and now with no dignity even of departure left to me, having come crawling back at the first kind word. I will not risk it. I have too little left to gamble it on a morning's tears." "Then tell me what I must do," said the Duke low. "Name it. Anything. I will do anything." And Susannah looked at him a long moment, and something in her, some last unbroken core of the brave, generous woman who had resolved, a year ago, to make the best of an impossible thing, decided to give him and herself one last chance, not to surrender, but to test. "I will not leave this morning," she said at last. "That much I will grant you. I will stay, not as your wife, not yet, not in any true sense, but in the house a little longer, and we shall see. But understand me clearly, Your Grace, for I will say it only once. I am not one. The letters you read were written to a husband I had given up. They are not a key that unlocks me. They are an account of what you threw away, and the throwing away is not undone by the reading. If you wish to keep me, if you truly wish it, and it is not merely this morning's storm, then you must do the thing you never troubled to do in a year of marriage. You must win me. Court me, Your Grace, as you never courted me. Earn me as you never earned me. Show me, not in 1 hour but over weeks and months, in the daily, ordinary, unglamorous proof that does not fade with the morning, that the man I foolishly came to love is real and means to stay, and wants the woman and not merely the absolution. Do that, and I am yours, gladly, wholly. I will not pretend otherwise. Fail at it, and I go to Ashworth after all, and we are both where we were. Those are my terms. I am your wife-in-law, and you may command me, but you will not have my heart by command. You must earn it like any other man courting any other woman, save that this woman has already told you, in a letter you were never meant to read, that she is more than half won already, if only you do not waste the chance a second time. Now, I am going up to unpack one trunk, only one. The rest stay corded against your failing. Good morning, Your Grace. You may begin whenever you are ready." And she had inclined her head and gone up the stairs, leaving her husband and his grandmother staring after her, and the dowager, after a moment, had let out a short bark of fierce, admiring laughter and said, "There, Alexander, there is the woman you have spent a year despising. I do hope, for your sake, that you prove equal to her. I have my doubts." And the Duke of Roxholm, looking up the empty stairs, found that he hoped so too, more than he had ever hoped for anything, and that the courting of his own wife had become, in the space of one morning, the great object of his life. And so the Duke of Roxholm set about the strangest and most humbling task of his life, the wooing of the wife he already had. He courted her as he had never courted any woman, with patience, with humility, with a daily attention that asked nothing and pressed for nothing, only sought slowly to show her that the change was real. He sought out her company and learned, to his astonishment, what his grandmother in his letters had told him, that she was the most interesting companion he had ever known, clever and dryly funny and deep, with a mind that met his own as an equal and bettered it as often as not. He brought the affairs of the estate to her, the ruined estate he had been laboring alone to mend, and discovered that the banker's daughter understood money and management as he never had, saw at a glance the errors his pride had made, and could set the whole tangled business on a sounder footing in a month than he had managed in 3 years, so that the wife he had married for her dowry and despised proved, when he finally let her near it, to be worth 100 times her dowry in the saving of his house, not for her money, but for her mind. And above all, he did the thing she had done for a year in secret. He wrote to her. He left letters for her now, letters of apology, of confession, of a slowly unfolding devotion, left them where she would find them, as she had once left hers where he never would, so that the cold marriage that had been carried on in silence began at last to be carried on in ink, a true correspondence between two people learning, late, to say the things they had both been too proud to speak. "You wrote to me for a year," one of his letters said, "and I never knew. Let me write to you now for the rest of my life the answers you should have had all along, for I find I have a great deal to say to you, and a great deal to atone for, and a pen seems the proper instrument for both, since it was a pen that saved us." Susannah, watching warily, holding her dignity, keeping her trunks corded, found the wariness harder and harder to maintain, for the change, she was slowly forced to admit, did not fade, as she had feared. The Duke did not relapse into coldness when the first storm of feeling passed. He grew instead steadily warmer, steadily more himself, the cold, proud shell cracking week by week to reveal the man she had glimpsed and loved, and she found her cautious heart, against all its careful defenses, beginning to unclench, to hope, to believe. But she would not say so, not yet. She held to her terms. She made him earn it day by day, as she had said she would. And the Duke, who had a year of cruelty to atone for, earned it gladly and counted himself fortunate in the earning. The weeks of the courtship, the wooing of the wife he already had, were, Susannah said afterward, the happiest of her life to that point, precisely because she held herself back from happiness and made him earn each step, so that every small advance was a thing won and savored rather than simply given. He began clumsily, for he had no practice at it. A man who has been cold for a year does not become charming overnight, and the Duke's first attempts at courtship were stiff and self-conscious and occasionally absurd. And Susannah, watching the proud Duke of Roxholm fumble through the unfamiliar business of trying to please a woman, found a great deal of private amusement in it, and a great deal of secret tenderness, for there is something disarming in watching a formidable man be awkward for love. He brought her things, a book he had noticed her admire, a rare flower from the hothouse, small offerings left without ceremony where she would find them. He sought her conversation and learned to wait through her cool, guarded replies for the rare warm ones, and to value the warm ones the more for the waiting. He began, tentatively, to confide in her, to bring her, at first in small things and then in great, the troubles of the estate he had carried alone so long. And when he found that she met his confidences not with the triumph he had once dreaded, but with a quick, sympathetic intelligence that lightened the load merely by sharing it, he brought her more and more, until within a month they were working the great tangled business together of an evening, heads bent over the same ledgers, the banker's daughter and the Duke, and the cold, separate rooms of the year before were forgotten. It was in those working evenings, more than in any flowers or fine speeches, that Susannah felt her wariness truly give way, for there is an intimacy in shared work, in two minds bent on a common problem, that no courtship of mere compliments can rival, and she found in it the thing she had longed for through the whole cold year, to be of use to him, to be his partner and not his ornament or his burden, to bring her own real powers to bear on his real troubles and be valued for them. "He lets me help him now," she wrote, for she still wrote, though her letters now were sometimes sent and sometimes left to be found, the habit of the pen too dear to abandon. "He brings me the accounts and asks my opinion and, wonder of wonders, takes it, and we sit of an evening over the books like two clerks in my father's counting-house, and I have not been so happy since I was a girl in that counting-house myself, of use and valued and at home. I think I could forgive him a great deal for the simple gift of letting me be useful to him at last. I think indeed I have nearly forgiven him the whole of it, but I shall not tell him so yet. Let him work a little longer. It does him good, and it does me good to watch, and there is no hurry now, for I am not going to Ashworth after all, though the trunks are still corded in the box room, and shall stay corded a while yet, just to keep him honest." And the Duke wrote back, for the Mirror. Correspondence had become the sweetest thing between them, the cold year's silence redeemed in a daily exchange of ink. "Keep the trunks corded as long as you like, my dear. I find I court better under threat, and besides, I have not nearly finished saying all the things I was too proud to say for a year, and shall need a great while yet to say them in. I had a whole 12 months' worth of unspoken words dammed up in me, it seems, and now that the dam is broken I cannot stop. You have married, I am afraid, a man who means to talk your ear off for the rest of your life, by way of making up for the year he hardly spoke to you at all. I hope you will bear it. You bore my silence so patiently. I can only hope my conversation proves easier company, though knowing what a fool I can be, I make no promises." And Susannah, reading it, had laughed aloud, alone in her room, the first free laugh of her married life, and had thought that she would, on the whole, take the talkative, repentant Duke over the silent, proud one 1,000 times, and had gone down to dinner that evening with a lightness in her step that the whole household remarked, for the cold countries had become one country at last, and even the servants felt the thaw. The matter was brought to its public crisis and its public resolution at the great ball given that season by the Marchioness of Wexford, Lady Camilla's own mother, to which all the county came, and at which Lady Camilla Devereux, who had heard with fury that the Roxholm marriage was somehow mending instead of breaking, that the upstart Duchess had not gone to Ashworth after all, that the Duke was paying his wife a marked and growing attention, resolved to make one last and decisive move. She would, before the whole assembled county, put the upstart Duchess in her place so thoroughly, expose her low origin so cruelly, that the Duke, whose pride Camilla still counted upon, not understanding how far it had been humbled, would be shamed out of his strange new devotion and recalled to his proper contempt, and the field would be cleared at last. And she chose her moment, as such women do, when the great ballroom was full and the Duchess was within a cruel circle's hearing, and she struck. "Why, Duchess?" said Lady Camilla in her caring, silvery voice, with the whole bright circle attending and the Duke not 10 feet off. "How brave you are to come among us all again after everything. One did hear the most distressing things, that poor Roxholm had quite repented his bargain, that you were to be sent away to the country, that the whole sad business of buying one's way into a great family had ended just as everyone predicted it must. And yet here you are, holding your head up as though you belonged among us. I do admire your courage. Tell me, for we are all simply dying to know, does your father's bank give lessons in it? In how to carry oneself, I mean, when one was not precisely born to the manner? It must be such a useful thing in trade to learn to ape one's betters. I am sure there is a great demand for it in the city." And the bright circle tittered, and waited, with the cruel pleasure of the fashionable scenting blood, for the upstart Duchess to crumble. But Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, did not crumble. She had crumbled once, at another such circle, when her husband sat silent and let her be shamed. But she was not the same woman now, and she had learned in the hardest year of her life exactly what she was worth and exactly what such people were. And she turned to Lady Camilla with a composure so complete that the titters died, and answered her, clear and unhurried, before them all. "You are very kind to admire my courage, Lady Camilla, though I assure you it requires none to stand among this company. I have faced a counting-house full of my father's clerks at the half-year audit, and I promise you it is a great deal more formidable than a ballroom. As for lessons in carrying oneself, no, my father's bank gives none, but it gave me something I have found more useful, which is the habit of knowing the true value of things, and not mistaking the price for the worth. It is the first thing one learns in the city, and the last thing, it seems, that one learns anywhere else. So let me tell you what I have learned to value, since you ask. I do not value a great name. I have seen too many of them mortgaged to the hilt and propped up by the very trade they affect to despise, to think a name worth much that cannot pay its own bills. I do not value fashion or birth or the art of the elegant insult, in which I freely grant you are my superior. I value honesty and kindness and a fortune honestly made. And my father's, Lady Camilla, was made by lending money to gentlemen who could not manage their own, which I have always thought rather to his credit, and rather less to theirs. I am not ashamed of the city. The city's money is clean. It was earned. I have been in the great world a year now, and I have observed that a good deal of its money is neither, and I have observed, too, that those who sneer loudest at trade are very often those most deeply in debt to it. You will forgive me if I do not blush for my origins. I find, on the whole, that I would rather be the daughter of an honest banker than the ornament of a dishonest age. And if that is vulgar of me, then I am content to be vulgar, and I wish the rest of the company joy of their gentility and of the tradesmen's bills they have not paid." And she inclined her head with perfect grace, and the circle was silent, not tittering now, but staring, some shocked, more than a few suppressing smiles, for the upstart had not crumbled but had turned the whole cruelty back upon its author with a wit and a dignity that left Lady Camilla Devereux standing white and speechless, exposed before her own mother's ballroom as a snob who had picked a fight with her better and been routed. And then the Duke of Roxholm, who had stood not 10 feet off and heard the whole of it, did the thing that he had failed to do at that other dinner, the failure that had nearly cost him everything. He crossed the floor to his wife's side before the whole assembled county, and he did it publicly and unmistakably, and with a deliberate, ringing finality that no one in that ballroom would ever forget. "My wife," he said, into the silence, taking his place beside her and offering her his arm, his voice carrying to every corner of the great room, "has answered you so much better than I could, Lady Camilla, that I need add very little. But I find I have a confession to make to this company, and I had as well make it here and now, since the subject has been so kindly raised. For a year I behaved toward my wife exactly as Lady Camilla would have me behave. held her origins against her, valued her as a transaction, treated her with a cold contempt I am now ashamed to my soul to remember. And I was wrong completely and stupidly and unforgivably wrong as a man can be. I married, as everyone in this room knows, to save my estate, which my father had ruined. I have let it be thought that I married beneath me, and I stand here tonight to tell you all that it was the precise reverse of the truth. I did not marry beneath me. I married a woman so far above me, in sense, in dignity, in generosity, in every quality that makes a human being worth knowing, that I have spent the past months in a state of perpetual astonishment that I was ever permitted to do it. The honor of the match was entirely on my side. The Roxholm name did not stoop to the Goodwin fortune. The Goodwin merit raised up the Roxholm name, which without it would have gone bankrupt and disgraced, as a dozen prouder names will shortly do for want of an honest banker's daughter to save them. I am not ashamed of my wife's origins. I am ashamed only of the year I wasted being ashamed of them, and I count myself the most fortunate man in this kingdom that she has not yet, despite the most extreme provocation, washed her hands of me entirely. There, that is my confession. And anyone in this room who wishes to sneer at the Duchess of Roxholm may do so, but they will be sneering henceforth at the woman I honor above every other soul alive, and they will answer to me for it. And I do not think, Lady Camilla, that they will find it so amusing as they once did. And he had raised his wife's hand to his lips, there before the whole staring county, and held it. And the ballroom, which had come for a spectacle, had got a far greater one than it bargained for, and did not soon recover from it. And Lady Camilla Devereux, finding herself routed, exposed, and publicly bested by the upstart and the husband both, retired from the field that night, and from that season's pretensions altogether, and is of no further interest to anyone. It was, Susannah thought, standing with her hand in her husband's before the whole of the world that had despised her, hearing him honor her publicly, as he had once publicly let her be shamed, the exact and complete reversal of the worst moment of her life, the wound healed in the very place it had been dealt, and she found, standing there, that the last of her wariness was simply gone, dissolved, impossible to maintain in the face of a man who would stand up before all society and confess himself a fool for love of her. But she did not say so even then, for there was a thing that wanted saying first, in private, between the two of them, before she would say the rest. And so she waited until they were home, and the great cold house was quiet, and they stood once more in the hall where he had begged her not to go. And there, at last, she finished what the letters had begun. "You have done everything I asked," she said, in the quiet hall, "and a great deal I did not ask, and more than I had any right to hope for, and I find I can hold out against you no longer, nor do I wish to. But before I say the thing I am going to say, I want you to be certain of one matter, for it is the matter on which the whole of the rest of our lives depends. I will not be loved out of guilt, Alexander. I will not be cherished as your penance, the wife you wronged and must now make amends to, a debt of conscience you spend your life repaying. I have been a transaction once already in this marriage, your salvation bought and paid for, and I will not now become a transaction of a different kind, your atonement, your good deed, the cross you take up to punish yourself for the year you were cruel. I had rather still go to Ashworth than be loved as a duty, even a tender one. So tell me truly as I wrote in those letters you were never meant to read, when you stood up tonight before all the world and called me the woman you honor above every soul alive. Was that guilt and conscience and the wish to make amends? Or was it love, the plain, ordinary love of a man for the woman he cannot do without, that would be just as strong if you had never wronged me at all, that has nothing to atone for and asks nothing but to love and be loved? For I will live with the one, gladly, all my life, and I will not live with the other, however kind, and you must tell me which it is, and I will believe you, for whatever else has passed between us, I have never known you to lie." And the Duke of Roxholm took both her hands and answered her with the plain truth she had asked for. "It is not guilt," he said, The guilt is real, and I shall carry it always, and I deserve to, but it is not why I love you, and it is not what I felt tonight. I love you, Susannah, as I have never loved anyone or anything in my life. Not because I wronged you, but because you are the finest and dearest and most wholly admirable person I have ever known, and because a life with you in it is the only life I can now imagine wanting, and because, God help me, I think I should love you exactly this much if I had courted you honestly from the first and had nothing whatever to be sorry for. The guilt would make me kind to you. It is the love that makes me unable to live without you. They are different things, and I know the difference, and I am offering you the second and not the first. I do not want to atone to you. I want to be married to you, truly married as we never have been, for the rest of our lives, because I love you and for no other reason in the world. That is the truth. Now you have it, as plainly as your letters gave me yours. And Susannah, Duchess of Roxholm, looked into her husband's face and weighed it with the clear, honest judgment that was her birthright from an honest man, and found it true, and she chose him freely, with her whole opened heart, not because she was his wife and bound to him, not from need, for she had proved she could leave him and live, but from the pure, free choice of a woman who has been offered, at last, the one thing she wanted, by a man who has earned the right to offer it. Then, yes, she said, and she was smiling now through tears, the first unguarded smile she had given him in a year of marriage. Then, yes, Alexander, with my whole heart, and no trunks corded against you ever again. I have loved you the better part of a year, as you now know, having read it in my own hand. I have only been waiting for you to catch me up. You have caught me up. Welcome, my dear, at long last, to your own marriage. I have kept it warm for you. I always hoped you would come. They began their true marriage that night, the marriage they had been too proud and too wounded to begin a year before. And it proved, in the years that followed, as happy as Susannah had once dared to hope and dared not believe, for they had come to it the hard way, through a year of frost and a season of patient thawing, and they valued it the more for what it had cost them, as one values most the things one has very nearly lost. The estate, under the new partnership, recovered and flourished as it had not done in 2 generations. For Susannah, the banker's daughter, took the management of the Roxholm fortune in hand alongside her husband and brought to it all the clear, shrewd sense of the city, and set the tangled, ruined business on so sound a footing that within a few years the dukedom that had stood one bad season from bankruptcy stood instead among the best managed estates in England, saved, in the end, not by her dowry, which had only bought time, but by her mind, which bought security, so that the Duke of Roxholm, who had married a banker's daughter for her money and despised her for it, found that her true fortune had been the one he never thought to count, and that the city merit he had sneered at had been the saving of his ancient name in a way no mere injection of gold could ever have managed. He never forgot it, and never ceased to be a little ashamed of how long it had taken him to see it. And he made certain ever after that the great world which had sneered at his wife's origins understood very clearly that the Duke of Roxholm regarded those origins as the best thing that had ever befallen his family. The old dowager lived long enough to see it all, and to take, with characteristic dryness, the entire credit. For had she not arranged the match, and found the girl, and put the letters into her fool of a grandson's hands at the 11th hour? She had, and she reminded them of it regularly, and they let her, for they owed her a great deal and were fond of her besides. And she died at last very contented, having seen the name she loved, not merely saved but happy, which she had not expected and counted pure profit. As for the letters, the year of unsent letters that had undone a year of loathing in a single night, Susannah kept them, all of them, tied in their faded ribbon, and her husband's answering letters with them, in a drawer of her writing desk, and now and again, in the long, contented years, when some small cloud passed between them, as clouds will pass even in the happiest marriages, one or the other of them would go quietly and take out the bundle and read a little, and remember how very nearly they had lost each other to their own proud silence, and how a heart spoken at last, even a heart spoken only to a page, had been the saving of them, and the remembering would mend the small cloud directly. "We were saved by the things we wrote and dared not say," the Duke observed once, reading over his wife's shoulder. I think it is the lesson of our lives, my dear, that the things we are too proud to speak are very often the things most worth the speaking, and that a great deal of the world's grief is only people loving one another in silence, and each believing themselves unloved. We will not make that mistake again, you and I. We have used up our whole allowance of proud silence. There is to be nothing now between us but spoken truth and the occasional letter for old time's sake. And there was not, and they were happy, and it was the saving of them to the end of their days. There was the matter of Susannah's father to be set right, and the Duke set it right with a thoroughness that touched her more, perhaps, than anything he did for her own sake, for he understood, having read her letters, what her father's happiness had cost her, and he was resolved that the old man should have, at last, the welcome from his daughter's grand family that he had never been given. For Josiah Goodwin, through the whole cold year, had been kept in loving ignorance, had visited Roxholm beaming with pride, had been received by the Duke with a cold civility just short of insult, had been made to feel, in 100 genteel ways, the great family's contempt for the city man who had bought his way among them, and had borne it all with a humble dignity, telling himself it was only the natural reserve of the great, and that his Susannah was happy, which his Susannah had taken great care to let him believe. The Duke was now bitterly ashamed of how he had treated the old man, the honest banker whose fortune had saved Roxholm and whose daughter was the saving of Roxholm's master. And he set about making amends with characteristic thoroughness. He wrote to Mr. Goodwin a long letter, frank and humble, confessing, as far as a man may confess such things to a father, that he had not in the first year valued the treasure he had been given as he ought, and that he had come to understand his good fortune and meant henceforth to deserve it. And he invited the old man to Roxholm not as a tolerated necessity, but as an honored father, and received him, when he came, with a warmth and a deference that left Josiah Goodwin almost too moved to speak. And he did more than receive him warmly in private, he honored him in public. At the next great gathering, with the county looking on, the Duke of Roxholm presented his father-in-law, the banker, the city man, the self-made son of a Spitalfields weaver, with a marked and pointed respect, drew him into conversation, deferred to his judgment on matters of business before the listening great, made it unmistakably clear to all the proud company that the Duke of Roxholm regarded Josiah Goodwin not as a vulgar tradesman to be endured, but as a man of honor and ability whom he was proud to call kin, so that the old banker, who had spent his life being politely excluded from the circle into which his money could not buy him, found himself, in his daughter's grand world, at last and openly esteemed, and understood dimly that something had changed for the better in his daughter's marriage, though he never knew the half of how dark it had been before. Susannah watched her father bloom under the Duke's public regard, watched the old man's quiet pride in being, for once, treated as the equal he was, and felt her heart fill so full she could scarcely bear it. For of all the wrongs of the cold year, the wrong to her father, the contempt the old man had borne uncomplaining, the welcome he had been denied, had grieved her most, being the one she could do nothing about, and to see it set right, generously and publicly, and without her asking, told her more surely than any flower or letter that her husband had truly understood, at last, the whole shape of what he had done and undone. "You did not have to honor my father so," she said to him that night. "He never reproached you. He never knew the worst. You might have left it." "I might," the Duke said, "but I read in a letter you wrote in the spring that you bore my coldness in part to spare your father the knowledge that his great gift had been a grief, and I thought a man who would let his wife carry that, alone, for a year, to protect an old man's happiness, and who never once thought to honor the old man himself, had a great deal of making up to do, and had better begin with the father, since the father's wrong was the one you felt most and spoke of least. I am only sorry it took me so long to learn to read you. You wrote me everything, Susannah. It is all in the letters. I have only to do now what the letters told me you needed all along. You wrote me the whole map of your heart, and I have it by me, and I mean to follow it the rest of my life." And Susannah, hearing that, had understood that she was loved, not vaguely, but precisely, loved by a man who had studied her very soul in a year of letters and meant to honor every line of it, and had thought that perhaps the cold year had bought her, in the end, a rarer thing than an easy courtship ever could, a husband who knew her wholly to the bottom and loved exactly what he knew. The old Dowager Duchess took, as she had promised, the entire credit for the whole affair, and was not, in justice, very far wrong to do so. For without her the letters would never have reached her grandson, and without the letters the two proud fools would have parted forever. And she knew it, and reminded them of it with a regularity that would have been insufferable in anyone less entitled to crow. She had earned her crowing. She it was who had found the heiress and pressed the match and saved the estate in the first place. She it was who, watching the marriage freeze, had alone among the family kept faith with the slighted Duchess and shown her kindness. And she it was who, at the 11th hour, had committed the one great impropriety of her decorous old life, rifling another woman's writing desk and carrying off her private letters, and had judged rightly that the impropriety was justified by the stake. "I have done many clever things in 75 years," she was fond of saying, in the contented years that followed. "But the cleverest by a long way was stealing your letters, my dear, and putting them where my idiot grandson could not avoid them. For I had tried reasoning with him for a year, and reasoning is wasted on a Roxholm in the grip of his pride. The only thing that ever penetrates that family skull is being shown, in plain ink, the thing they have been too proud to see. And so I showed him, since he would not look for himself. And there is the whole secret of it, and you may both be as grateful to me as you like, for I assure you it is no more than my due." And they were grateful, and let her crow, and grew very fond of the sharp old woman who had engineered their happiness almost in spite of themselves. And the dowager, for her part, having arranged the match for money and been rewarded with a granddaughter she came genuinely to love, declared that it was the one wholly satisfactory transaction of her long worldly life, in which she had got, for an outlay of mere cold calculation, a return of pure unlooked-for affection, which, she observed, is the best kind of bargain there is, and the rarest, and I recommend it to anyone, though one cannot, alas, contrive it on purpose. One can only arrange the marriage and hope the love turns up, as it did, no thanks to either of you. She lived several years more, long enough to dandle the first of their children and to pronounce it with deep satisfaction, a credit to both its lines, the Roxholm and the Goodwin equally. For it has its father's nose, poor mite, and its mother's sense, which is a great deal more useful, and with any luck it will have its grandmother Goodwin's head for figures, for this family has needed one for 300 years, and got one at last only by my contrivance. And she died at last in her bed, full of years and satisfaction, having seen the name she loved not merely saved from ruin, but lifted, by the despised city alliance she had arranged, into a prosperity and a happiness it had not known in living memory. They buried her with honor, and grieved her sincerely, and Susannah, who had loved the fierce old woman as the first member of that cold family ever to show her kindness, kept among her treasures ever after, alongside the bundle of letters, a short note the dowager had once written her. For the dowager, too, it transpired, had her tender side, though she guarded it as fiercely as her grandson guarded his, which read, in the old lady's spiky hand, "You have been the making of this family, child, and the saving of my grandson, and the one unearned joy of my old age. And I arranged it all, and shall take the credit, but the credit is really yours, for you had only to be loved to save us. And being loved was the one thing you never schemed for, and the one thing you most deserved. Burn this. I should be mortified to be caught being sentimental, but know that I knew your worth from the first, even when the fool did not. A.R." Susannah did not burn it. She kept it with the letters where the truest things were kept, and read it sometimes in the long happy years, and was comforted. There is one more scene worth the telling, for it closes the circle of this story exactly where it opened, at the long dinner table of Roxholm in the candlelight, with the Duke and Duchess seated at either end, for that table had been, in the cold year, the very stage of their estrangement, and it became, in the warm years, the truest measure of how far they had traveled. In the cold year, you will remember, the Duke had not once looked down that table at his wife without the small cold tightening about his mouth, the look of a man reminded of a thing he would rather forget. And Susannah had learned to read it and to lower her eyes and to go on with her dinner with her heartbreak hidden. A year into their true marriage, a guest who had known them in the bad days came again to dine at Roxholm, and was so astonished by the change that she spoke of it for weeks afterward, for she found the same long table, the same candlelight, the same Duke and Duchess at either end, and an atmosphere so transformed that she could scarcely believe it the same house. The Duke looked down the table at his wife now, the guest reported, not with a cold tightening, but with a warmth he did not trouble to hide, would catch her eye over the centerpiece and exchange with her some private look, some small smile, the silent shorthand of two people who understand each other to the bone, would defer to her, draw her out, listen to her with a frank delight, would, now and again when the talk turned to the estate or to business, say openly to the company, "But you must ask the Duchess. She understands these things far better than I. She has the head for figures in this family, and the sense besides," and would say it with a pride so plain that no one could mistake it. The cold countries had become one country, the silent table had found its tongue, and the small cold tightening that had been the daily signature of the cold year was simply gone, replaced by its exact opposite, the warm, unguarded glance of a man who has learned late and at great cost to treasure what is his. And once, the guest did not see this, for it happened after she had gone, but Susannah recorded it, for she still kept her letters, sent and unsent alike. Once, late in such an evening, when the guests had departed and the candles burned low, and the two of them sat on alone at the long table, in the comfortable silence of the truly married, the Duke had reached down the length of it and taken his wife's hand and said, "Do you remember how we used to sit at this table, that first year? At the two ends of it, like enemies across a field, in a silence you could have cut with the fish knife. I used to look down at you and feel only my own wretched pride, and you used to look down at me and feel, God help me, I know now what you used to feel, for you wrote it down, and I have read it. And we sat here, the two of us, each breaking the other's heart in the candlelight and too proud to say a word. And now look at us. The same table, the same candles, the same two people, and the only thing changed is that we finally told each other the truth, or rather that you told me, in 100 letters, and I was at last fool enough to read them." And Susannah had pressed his hand and said, "It is a very long table, Alexander. I used to think that first year that it was the longest table in England, and that we should never reach each other across it, not if we lived to be 100. And here we are, reaching across it easily, every night. It was never the table that was long. It was only the silence. We have shortened the silence, and the table, I find, is exactly the right size for two people who have learned to speak." And the Duke had laughed low and risen, and gone down the length of that table to his wife, and they had gone up to bed together through the quiet house, in which there were no longer two cold countries but only one warm home. And that, more than the wedding that began them, or the letters that saved them, was the true end of their story. Two proud people, who had nearly lost each other to their own silence, grown old at last, not at the two ends of a long table, but side by side at the middle of it, where, as the Duke observed, the candlelight was best and the reaching easiest, and where they sat, by preference, every night they had left. So bank your fire now and turn your lamp low and let the dark draw gentle and close. A proud duke loathed his contracted wife for a season, loathed her for being the price of his rescue, and never once troubled to learn the woman behind the bargain, until he read by candlelight in a desperate 11th hour the letters she had written him all year and never sent, and found in them, too late and yet just in time, that the wife he had despised had seen him truly and loved him dearly and forgiven him freely, all in silence, all unguessed, and the reading of them undid in a single night the cruelty of a year, and a man learned, at the last possible moment, to win the wife he already had. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have read these letters over my shoulder, as it were, and stayed with two proud people until their silence broke. And I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you have been listening from. Remember that the things we do not say can grieve another heart as surely as the cruel things we do, and that it is never too late, while there is breath, to speak the truth. We have been too proud to speak. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit,